Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture. The plan for this lecture is as follows. So, in this lecture we will start discussing about BGW MPC protocol, which is one of the seminal results in the area of secure multi-party computation, and we will introduce the concept of shared circuit evaluation. So, let us first try to understand the setting of BGW MPC protocol. So, this seminal result is attributed to Benoit, Goldwasser and Wigderson. So, that is why it is called BGW protocol, and this result was published in the year 1988. And remember that we can design MPC protocols in various dimensions. So, let us first try to understand the dimension in which the BGW MPC protocol is proposed. So, it is a generic MPC protocol for any abstract function where the function is represented by an arithmetic circuit over some finite field. It is designed assuming that the underlying network is a synchronous network. It tolerates a threshold adversary where the corruption capability of the adversary is upper bounded by some publicly known threshold t. The adversary here is assumed to be computationally unbounded, that is interesting here. Okay. And even though the paper gives protocol, presents protocol for both passive corruptions as well as malicious corruptions, since in this course we are dealing with only passive corruptions, we will right now focus on passive corruption. Passive corruptions, that means we will assume that up to t parties can be passively corrupt and they are computationally unbounded. In the next course we will see the protocol to deal with t malicious corruptions. And for simplicity we will assume that the adversary is static, which decides the set of corrupt parties before the beginning of the protocol itself, but the protocol can be proved to be secure even against an adaptive adversary, but for simplicity we will stick to static corruptions. So, the level of security which is provided by the BGW MPC protocol is also called as perfect security, because we achieve security even against an adversary who is computationally unbounded. So, the notion of the security achieved is also called sometimes as unconditional security, because the security is not based on any computational hardness assumptions or any conditions. And it is also sometimes called as information theoretic security. And historically this is the first MPC protocol with these security guarantees, namely perfect security or unconditional security. And the protocol assumes the private channel model, namely it assumes that the underlying network is a complete network, abstracted as a complete network, and there is a private channel between every pair of parties. How do we instantiate such private channel model? For that you are referred to one of the earlier lectures for this course, right. So, as I said that the circuit abstraction followed by the BGW protocol is that of arithmetic circuit. So, here we assume that the parties have some publicly known function over some finite field. That finite field could be any finite field with an abstract plus an abstract dot operation, and the inputs of the parties are from the field and the function output is also a field element. We will make several simplifying assumptions when discussing or presenting the BGW MPC protocol, but all these simplifying assumptions are without loss of generality. That means even if these assumptions are not there, the protocol will work, but just for making the presentation easier I am making these simplifying assumptions. The first simplifying assumption is that each party has a single field element as an input for the function, right. So, I assume that party 1 has the input x1, which is a private input, and a single field element which is the input of the party. Similarly, P2 has a field element x2 which is the private input for the function, and so on. Of course, one can talk about a function where P1 has several inputs possible for the function. Say P1 has the inputs x1 and say x1, x11, x12 and x1l, and P2 has the P2 might have 2 inputs or m number of inputs, say x21, x22, and P3 might have no input and P4 might have 3 inputs. So, I can design the BGW MPC protocol even to securely compute such kind of function, but that will require additional variables to keep track of how many inputs for the function are coming from each party Pi. So, to avoid doing that, we make this simplifying assumption that each party has a single input for the function f, that is without loss of generality. We also make the simplifying assumption that there is a single function output which is supposed to be learnt by everyone, publicly it is supposed to be learnt. Again there could be variations. So, for instance, it could be the case that my function itself is an n array output function in the sense that it produces n outputs based on the inputs of the parties, where the ith output is supposed to be learnt only by Pi, and these outputs could be different outputs depending upon what is the nature of the function. In fact, some of the outputs could be a bot, that means there is no output for that specific party, that also could be the case. But I make the simplifying assumption that all these output values are a single field element which is going to be decided based on the function and the inputs, and this is supposed to be learnt by everyone. Publicly it is supposed to be learnt by everyone. Again this is the simplifying assumption, and this is without loss of generality. Okay. And the third simplifying assumption is that the function is a deterministic function. That means, once the inputs x1, x2, xn their values are decided, then the function, the output is computed as a deterministic function as per those inputs and the description of the function. There is no internal randomness which is used to compute the output of the function, namely the output y. Again this is without loss of generality. We can easily modify the BGW MPC protocol to deal with the case where internal random field elements are generated when computing the output y apart from the input values x1 to xn. Okay. So, we will abstract out this function f with these simplifying assumptions as some publicly known arithmetic circuit. That is important. The description of the arithmetic circuit will be publicly known. Okay. So, for example, this could be a candidate function for 4 inputs, each input is coming from one party. So, input x1 coming from first party and so on, and everyone will know that okay, these are the various gates in the function f or the various gates in the circuit representing the function f. Now, these gates can be categorized into various categories. So, to begin with, we will have what we call as input gates. In this, they are called input gates because they are the input values which are supposed to be contributed by the respective parties. Then in the circuit we will have linear gates or what we call as addition gate over the field. Okay. So, this gate means we want to add the values x1 and x2, and I am calling the result as I1, intermediate value I1. Or the circuit could have multiplication gates where the multiplication are performed over the finite field. So, we have 2 such multiplication gates present in this example circuit. The first multiplication gate is performing the product of x3 and x4, and the second multiplication gate is performing the product of the 2 intermediate results I1 and I2 and producing the output I3. Now, you might be tempted to say that okay, this is a multiplication gate as well, but this is not a multiplication gate, this is a multiplication by a publicly known constant C, where C is publicly known and an element of the finite field. So, this will be treated as a linear gate, because C times I 3 will be a linear function of I 3. It is equivalent to performing a linear computation over I 3. So, this is not a multiplication gate, but rather this is a linear gate, because this is a multiplication by a public constant. And then you have finally the output gate. So, now very often people ask the question that is it a valid assumption, a valid simplifying assumption to assume that the function can be abstracted by an arithmetic circuit? Can I represent any function, any computation, say an SQL query computation or performing some ML operations? Can I abstract all such complex operations, or say the sorting algorithm, every algorithm, any kind of computation, can I abstract it as an arithmetic circuit over some finite field? And the answer is yes, this is without loss of generality, because if you take any efficient algorithm or any efficient computation, computation means you are running some algorithm, it could be a graph algorithm, it could be a data structure algorithm, it could be any kind of algorithm, right. We can always represent it by an equivalent Boolean circuit, because finally when you run your algorithm inside your computer, it is converted into a binary code, and that binary code will be performing a sequence of Boolean operations inside your computer to get the result of the output of your algorithm. That means there will be an equivalent Boolean circuit which will be performing or which will be producing the same result as your algorithm or so called computation. Now, let us call that Boolean circuit as B sub sub. Okay. And it is a well known fact that NAND gates constitutes universal gates. That means any Boolean circuit which might have varieties of gates like XOR gates, OR gates, AND gates, NOT gates and so on, can be converted into an equivalent Boolean circuit which performs the same computation or produces the same result, but now the equivalent circuit will have only two types of gates, only AND gates and NOT gates, which together constitutes what we call as NAND gates. So, this is again a well known fact. Now, my claim is that Boolean circuit consisting of just AND and NOT gates and representing your underlying algorithm can be also simulated by an equivalent arithmetic circuit over some finite field. By simulated I mean I can represent, I can embed this Boolean circuit by, or I can find a corresponding arithmetic circuit A sir, and that circuit will be over the finite field where the elements will be where the values will be elements from the field and all the operations will be only the plus and the dot operations over the field, but that circuit A will produce or will have the same effect as if the circuit B is performing the computation. How this is possible? Well, there are several ways to do this. One obvious way is the following: whatever is your finite field that you have decided, say I have decided F to be the field ZP consisting of the elements 0 to p minus 1, and all my plus operations are addition modulo p and all my multiplication operations are multiplication modulo p. Then what I can do is the following: wherever you have the bit 0 coming in the Boolean circuit, I decide a rule that all such occurrences of 0 will be now replaced by the element 0 of the field. So, if I take the field to be ZP, then the element 0 of the field is basically the element 0, the integer 0. But if it could be any other abstract field. So, the bit 0 gets mapped to the 0 of the field, the bit 1 will be now mapped to the element 1 of the field. Again if I take ZP to be my candidate field, then what I am saying is that wherever you have the bit 1 coming into picture, replace it with the integer 1. Wherever in the Boolean circuit you have an operation where you are performing the negation of the bit B, that operation you now replace by performing this arithmetic operation. Namely, whatever is the element 1 means the multiplicative identity element minus the mapping of the bit B. So, again if I take this ZP as my candidate field, it is easy to see that this mapping works, because if my B is equal to 0, then negation of B will be 1. If B is equal to 1, negation of B will be 0. Now, let us see what will be the effect of performing the similar operation over the field as per this mapping. The element 1 will be 1 itself, the integer 1 itself. So, 1 minus B equal to 0, that will produce you the result 1, and 1 minus the B equal to 1 will produce the result 0 over the field. So, now you can see you get the same answer which you would have got in the Boolean circuit. The same results now you are getting by the equivalent arithmetic operations over the field. Okay. And now what about the AND operation? Because remember in the Boolean circuit I will have only two types of gates available, the NOT gate and the AND gate. So, if you have an AND gate where the inputs are A and B, replace that gate, not replace, find an equivalent gate in the arithmetic circuit where you perform the multiplication of the mapped A and the mapped B. Again with the candidate F that we have considered ZP, this will work, right. So, if your bits are A and B, then we know that the result of A and B will be 1 only when both the bits are 1, and the same will be the case if I consider the product of the field element A and the field element B, right. Because if any of these two field elements A or B is 0, then the product of 0 field element with any other field element will give me the result 0. Only when both the field elements A and B are non-zero, I will get a non-zero answer. So, that means this mapping is always going to work, and by doing this mapping I can always simulate the computations performed by the Boolean circuit by an equivalent arithmetic circuit, where the circuit just have values from the field and gates from the finite field. Okay. So, from now onwards we will assume that whenever we are talking about a function, I am basically talking about an equivalent arithmetic circuit. Okay. So, now another thing to notice here is the following. If I say that if I want to compute the value of the function on the inputs x1 to xn, that is equivalent to evaluating this arithmetic circuit over the inputs x1 to xn, because if the values of x1 to xn are made public, suppose I ask every party that okay, you make the values of your respective inputs public, announce it to everyone, then everyone can compute the value of the function output, because what they have to do is they already know the description of the function and hence the corresponding arithmetic circuit. They can evaluate each and every gate of the circuit and obtain all the intermediate results and the final output, and this will not require any interaction once the inputs are made public. So, for instance, if I consider this example computation, okay, where the function that we want to compute is x1 plus x2 multiplied with x3 and x4, and this thing overall getting multiplied with 6. Okay. This is the overall function y. And now, if I take the candidate values of x1, x2, x3, x4 to be 4, 3, 6 and 0, and say P1 announces that okay, my input is 4, P2 announces that my input is 3, P3 announces that my input is 6, and P4 announces that my input is 0. Then after that the parties need not have to interact at all, and they can evaluate each and every gate assuming that this is my field, and they will get the result of the function y. and this is called circuit evaluation in clear. Why in clear? Because you are knowing the value of the function input, and hence you are computing the circuit in clear, knowing each and every intermediate value and the final output and also the input values. But of course, this is not a secure solution, because in this solution, even though this is a very nice solution, you do not require any interaction among the parties, just take the inputs of the parties and evaluate the circuit, but the whole security is breached here, because you are learning the inputs of every other party. So, definitely this is not the way we are going to compute functions securely in our MPC protocol, but we need to do something and evaluate the function or the equivalent circuit without revealing the inputs of the parties or the intermediate results. And this is where the very pioneering approach of BGW comes into picture. So, the BGW protocol introduced what we call as shared circuit evaluation, and this is very different from circuit evaluation in clear, where the inputs are announced in public and then every party just locally evaluates the circuit. In this approach, every party will be evaluating a copy of the circuit on some values, but the circuit will be evaluated in such a way that if I consider any subset of T parties, from their viewpoint, they are basically evaluating the circuit on some garbage values. That is the idea here, and this ensures that if during the circuit evaluation, if any set of T parties collude together and then they exchange among themselves that okay, what is the version of the circuit they have evaluated. Well, the circuit will remain the same. On what values they have evaluated the circuit, that will not help them to reveal any information regarding the inputs of the parties. Only the function output will be revealed. That is how the BGW approach performs circuit evaluation. So, as I said, the BGW protocol works under the assumption that T is the number of corruptions in the system, and we are talking about semi-honest corruptions here. By semi-honest corruptions, I stress that the parties will follow the protocol instructions, they will not deviate. That means, they will not send wrong values or they will not crash and so on. They will honestly perform the protocol instructions, but they are semi honest in the sense that once the protocol gets over, they will now try to infer something about the inputs of the other parties based on whatever they have learnt in the protocol, which they are not supposed to do. That is why they are semi honest. So, the approach, the BGW approach behind this shared circuit evaluation is as follows. To begin with, it will be ensured that the inputs for the function which are going to come from the respective parties, they are going to be made available to the parties in a secret shared fashion, where the threshold of the sharing will be T, because T is the maximum number of corruptions in the system, and T is a parameter which will be publicly known. Remember, N is the number of parties, that is publicly known. T again is a parameter which denotes the unknown set of corrupt parties, not unknown set of unknown number of, it basically denotes the maximum number of corruptions which can happen in the system. That means, this value T will be known, but who exactly are those set of T corrupt parties, no one will know when the protocol starts. It is only the adversary who knows that okay, I am going to control this set of T parties. So, to begin with, in the BGW shared circuit evaluation, the inputs of the parties will be secret shared, and they will be secret shared in a random way, in the sense that each party will have a single share for each input of the function, and together the vector of n shares constitute a random n comma t secret sharing for that input. What does that mean? So, if I consider this input x 1, in circuit evaluation in clear approach, P 1 would have announced publicly that this is the value of my input x 1. We are not doing that. Instead, in the BGW approach, we are asking the party number P 1, Okay, you are the owner of the input x 1. You create a secret sharing for your input x 1 by running an instance of n comma t secret sharing scheme. So, P 1 will act as the dealer because it is the owner of the input x 1 and it will create shares of the input x 1. So, I am taking here the case where n is equal to 4 and t is equal to 2 for the sake of demonstration. So, it will create 4 random shares for its input x 1, which will have the property that any set of 2 shares among those 4 shares leaks no information about the input x 1, but 3 or more number of shares are sufficient to recover back the input x 1. And now it will do the following, it will distribute the shares of its input. I am calling those shares as x 1 1, x 1 2, x 1 3 and x 1 4. One share of the input x 1 will be given to each party. So, P 1 will have its own share for its own input x 1, P 2 will have its share x 1 2, P 3 will have its share of x 1, call it x 1 3 and P 4 will have its share for the input x 1, call it x 1 4. By doing this, it will be ensured that if P 1 is not under the control of the adversary, well, in this example I am taking P 1 to be under the control of the adversary. So, of course, it knows the complete P 1, a complete x 1 and of course, all the 4 shares, because P 1 itself has distributed those 4 shares and since adversary is instructing or controlling the P 1, it will know what are those 4 shares. But consider another execution where P 1 is not under the control of the adversary, it is another set of 2 parties. Those 2 parties will get access to 2 shares of x 1, but those 2 shares will be insufficient to identify what exactly is the value of x 1. The same thing will be now done for the input x 2. 4 random shares x 2 1, x 2 2, x 2 3 and x 2 4 will be computed and distributed to the respective parties. It constitutes a vector of 4 comma 2 secret sharing for x 2, same will be done for x 3 and same will be done for x 4. This will complete the input stage. You now see that the inputs are no longer announced in public, but rather they are made available in a secret shared fashion. Now comes the interesting part, the gate evaluations, and while performing the gate evaluation, the parties will try to maintain what we call as BGW gate invariant. What does this invariant tries to maintain? The invariant that the parties try to maintain is the following. If the gate inputs are randomly n comma t secret shared, then the parties try to ensure that even the gate output is made available in a secret shared fashion. So, for instance, if the value of x 1 and x 2 would have been known in clear, everyone could have found the value of I 1, the first intermediate output, because they would have to just add the value of x 1 and x 2. But right now no one knows the exact value of x 1 and no one knows the exact value of x 2. The gate invariant tries to ensure that if we consider this plus gate, and right now every party has its own share for the inputs of this plus gate. The inputs are x 1 and x 2. No one knows the value of x 1 and x 2, but each party has its own share of x 1 and own share of x 2. This BGW gate invariant will try to ensure that based on the shares of the inputs of this plus gate, each party is somehow able to compute a share of the intermediate gate output. That means, P 1 will perform some computation on x 1 1 and x 2 1 to arrive at x I 1 1. P 2 will try to perform some computation on x 1 2 and x 2 2 and arrive at this share I 1 2. P3 will perform some computation on x13 and x23 and arrive at this share x13, and P4 will perform some computation on x14, x24 and arrive at the share I14, and together this I11, I12, I13 and I14 will constitute a vector of 4, 2 secret sharing of the clear value I1. So, in essence what this gate invariant is trying to do is the following: instead of evaluating the gates on clear inputs and obtaining the gate output in clear, the gates are now evaluated on the shares of the gate input, and somehow parties are trying to obtain the shares of the gate output. But in the process no one learns what exactly was the exact value of the gate input and what exactly was the exact value of the gate output, because everything is performed in a secret shared fashion, and that is why this approach is called as the shared circuit evaluation, right. So, this plus gate will be evaluated like this by every party first, and then similar thing will parties will do on the multiplication gate. Based on the shares of the multiplication gates, inputs of the multiplication gates, parties will perform some computation and obtain what we call as their respective shares of the intermediate value. And now they will continue maintaining this invariant for all other gates, layer by layer by layer. Okay. Now, like this, once the entire circuit is evaluated in a secret shared fashion, right. By the way, maintaining this gate invariant might require interaction among the parties, because it may not always the case that just add the shares x11 and x21 you get I11, that may or may not be the case, or just multiply the shares x31, x41 and get the share I21, that may or may not be the case. How exactly this invariant is maintained, we will discuss that later. Right now I am just explaining you the approach, but looking ahead we will see that maintaining this invariant may require interaction among the parties sometime, unlike the circuit evaluation in clear, where once the inputs are made public no interaction is required among the parties. Now, once the function output is computed in a secret shared fashion, that means all the gates have been evaluated and each party now has its own share for the final output, the parties publicly reconstruct that output. And how they can reconstruct? Well, they can just announce their shares of this y value to each other. And right now I am assuming semi honest corruption, that means even the bad parties they will announce the correct value of the respective share of y. Now, once every party made their respective shares of y public, we will have the full vector of shares for the y value, and now the parties can apply the reconstruction algorithm of your secret sharing scheme and reconstruct back the function output y. Now, why this shared circuit evaluation will ensure the privacy property? Intuitively, what has happened in this entire shared circuit evaluation? Each value right from the input all the way to the output is not learned by any party. Of course, the party who is providing a particular input, it will know that okay, this is my input and I have distributed these shares for my input, but for the inputs which are not known to a party, for those values altogether the adversary sees T shares, and T shares as per the n comma T secret sharing scheme reveals no information about those values. And even for the intermediate results, assuming that this BGW gate invariant is maintained securely, that means starting with the inputs of the gate which are secret shared, we obtain the gate output in a secret shared fashion, and in the process nothing additional about the gate inputs and gate output is revealed. What we are ensuring in this whole approach is that each value except the output value remains secret shared, and the degree of sharing throughout is ensured to be T, and adversary even though each party is evaluating its circuit, local copy of the circuit over some shares, adversary if it controls T parties, it will see the evaluations of T parties. Through those T evaluations, basically for each value in the computation, it will get access to T shares, but each value is going to be independently and randomly secret shared with threshold T, and that does not help the adversary to learn any information about the intermediate results. It is only the final output which is publicly reconstructed, but that is anyhow is allowed to be learnt by every party, and that is not a privacy breach. And that is why this BGW approach ensures the privacy property. So, now the big question is how exactly the inputs are secret shared and how exactly this gate invariant is maintained. How can it be possible that without even knowing the gate inputs, but every party being just given access to its share for the input values, somehow they magically obtain the shares of the output value. How exactly that gate invariant is maintained? That precisely is the whole crux of BGW MPC protocol. So, these are the references which are used for today's lecture. There are several nice papers available for the detailed description and analysis of BGW protocol. These two are very nice resources and you are referred to them. Thank you.